A Lantern, Chapter 36. Final chapter. Grace Deal and her roadster went back to summer school early in the morning. John Deal and his family left about the same time for Cedartown. Isabel and Harrison Rhodes were remaining in Omaha for a few days' visit at Mac's before making the rounds of the other homes. Abby rode back with Margaret and Dr. Baker. On the way, Margaret asked, "Don't you want to go on up to Lincoln with us for a few days, Mother?" "No, oh no," Abby said hastily. "I'm tired and I'll be real glad to get home again." When the big car stopped under the Lombardy poplars near the sitting room porch of the old farmhouse, Margaret got out with her mother and helped her up the short walk to the house. "I just can't bear to leave you here alone, Mother. Don't you want me to stay all night with you? Fred could run out and get me tomorrow, or I could go in on the morning train." "No, oh no, I'm all right. I'm just tired from all the excitement. When you're used to being alone, you don't mind it a bit." "Promise me you would call someone on the phone the first minute you didn't feel well." "I promise. I'd call Christine. She's got a phone in now, but she certainly begrudges the money. Anyway, I won't be alone much more this summer. Isabel will be here next week, and Grace will be home again soon. And Laura is going to come and stay a few days." When they had gone, Abby Deal opened some of the windows to air out the house. She had a whimsical notion that the things seemed glad to have her back. The table where old Doc Matthews had rolled his pills, the walnut cupboard, Will's corner whatnot. There was something human about them, as though they shared her thoughts, as though having come through the years with her, they held the same memories. She fed her chickens, watered the sweet peas, picked the dried leaves off her geraniums, and went over the whole yard as though to greet every bush and shrub after her absence. For the next few days she went slowly about her household duties with the same little sense of pleasure she always experienced after she had been to one of her children's homes. How could old women bear to sit around with folded hands? What mattered it that the children all had such nice houses? There would never be any real home for her but the old wing and upright set in the cedars and poplars. By Friday night she had accomplished a lot of extra small tasks, setting an old hen that was foolishly wanting to raise a family out of season, gathering some early poppy seeds, and putting fresh papers on her pantry shelves. At 5:30 she started her supper. As she worked, she tried to hum an old tune she had known when she was young, an old song she had not thought of in years and years, until Isabel had sung it over the radio in the winter. "Oh, the lady of the lea, fair and young and gay was she." She had to make long pauses between the syllables to get her breath. "Beautiful exceedingly, the lady of the lea." Her voice cracked and went up or down without her volition, so that even though her mind heard the song, her ear scarcely recognized the melody. Many a wooer sought her hand, for she had gold and she had land. Everything la la la. She had forgotten what the words were right there. The lady of the lea. She was completely out of breath, so that she had to sit down a few minutes before starting to put her dishes on the kitchen table. As she sat looking at the old table, she suddenly wished she could pull it out, put in all the leaves, set the places for the children, and then call them in from play. Not the prosperous grown people she had been with so recently in Omaha, but just as they were when they were little. Queer how plainly she could see them in her mind. Mac's merry round face with its sprinkling of freckles, Margaret's long dark pigtail, her gray eyes and her laughter, Isabel's reddish-brown curls and her big brown eyes, Grace's square little body with her apron strings always untied, John's serious face, a sort of little old man who did not want to be hugged. How real they seemed to her. One could almost imagine that it was they who were playing Run Sheep Run out there now instead of the neighbor children. Abby Deal had never forbidden the North End children access to her yard, and their high-pitched voices calling, "Going east! Going west!" came to her now from the region of the cottonwood windbreak. Yes, it sounded for all the world like her own children out there. As she got up and went about her supper, putting a little piece of meat on to cook, her mind slipped to the fact that she had promised to make a short talk on the following week at the 60th anniversary of the founding of the city of Lincoln. She must begin to think of what she could say. There was plenty to talk about, but she dreaded the speaking. She hoped her voice wouldn't quaver and break. That was the trouble of being old. Your body no longer obeyed you. It did unruly and unreasonable things. An eye suddenly might not see for a moment. Your knees gave out at the wrong time, so that when you thought you were walking north, you might find yourself a little northwest. Your brain, too, had the same flighty trick. You might be speaking of something and forget it temporarily. Your mind was going off a little to the northwest, too, so to speak. She glanced up to see what time it was and discovered that the clock had stopped. Whatever had happened to the faithful old thing, for she was sure she had wound it. She opened the door with the little brown church painted on the glass and reached for the key. Suddenly, so suddenly that it was like a flash, a queer feeling came over Abby Deal. It was unlike any she had ever experienced. A tightening of the throat and chest, as of cold icy hands upon her. She tried to take her arms down from their stretched position, but it was almost impossible to move them for the pain. In a moment the icy hands released their hold upon her as quickly as they had clutched at her, but they left her so weak and shaken that she started into her bedroom, holding on to the backs of the chairs. She lay down on the bed to get herself in hand. There was a sharp pain now in the back of her head, and it seemed a little hard to breathe. For a moment she wondered if it could be that her time to die had come. No, that could not be. She was a little sick, but she had been so many times. I never do die, she said to herself, and smiled a little at the humor of it. The sun rays slanted across the floor from the west sitting room windows. The meat was cooking, for the air was filled with the odor of it. Robins were singing outside in the poplars. The neighbors' children ran across the yard with the cries of "All outs and free!" They would trample the grass a little, but children were worth more than grass anyway. She must not get sick, for she was planning to go do something in a few days. For a few moments she could not think what it was, and then she remembered. It was the old settlers' meeting in Lincoln. There would be a lot of old folks there, and they would tell their reminiscence all day. No doubt she would be bored to distraction. Old people usually bored her. No, that was not right. Something was wrong with that thought. She was not young, she was old. She herself was one of the old settlers. How strange. Well, she would go. Her mind seemed not quite under control. She tried hard to think whether she was to go in the big shiny sedan on the straight graveled roads or in the creaking wagon through the long swaying grass. Blow, wave, ripple, dip. Blow, wave, ripple, dip. She felt ill. It was the swaying of the prairie grass that made her ill. If she were taken sick, she had promised to do something. Something with the little brown box at the side of the bed. Suddenly she remembered. Call Christine. That was it. Good old Christine. Old friends were best. Maybe she ought to call Christine in the little brown box. Her arm slipped around the rolled silk quilt at the foot of the bed. Such a soft silk quilt. And an old patch quilt in front of the sheep shed for a door. There it was again, her mind going northwest. The sun slanted farther across the carpet. Whoever was frying that meat was letting it burn. The children shouted very close to the house, "Run, sheep, run!" It was nice to know the children were all well and out there playing. Mac and Margaret, John and Isabel, Grace and the baby. She hoped they would be taking good care of the baby with a face like a little white rose. She would let them play on until she got to feeling better, and then she would get up and finish supper. That queer thought of death intruded itself again, but she reasoned slowly and simply with it. If death were near, she would be frightened. Death was her enemy. All her life she hated death and feared it. It had taken her mother and Will and the baby and countless old friends. But death was not near. The children playing outdoors, the sun slanting over the familiar carpet, the meat frying for supper. All the old simple things to which she was accustomed reassured her. A warm feeling of contentment slipped over her to hear the children's happy voices. "All's outs and free," they called. It was almost time for Will to come in to his supper. It was the nicest part of the day. The robins singing in the poplars, the meat cooking, the supper table set, everyone coming home, the whole family around the table, all, Will, the children. She must wind the clock before they come in. You couldn't stop time. It was hard again to breathe, the icy pain in her chest. Oh! Immediately the children were quiet. The robin had stopped singing. Whoever had been frying meat had removed it from the stove, and someone must have pulled down all the shades. It was strange to have all those things happen at once. The robin ceased singing, the children stopped playing, the meat taken from the stove, and the shades pulled down. For a moment it was as though one could neither see nor hear nor smell. At any rate, she felt much better. The pressure in her chest and in the back of her head was gone. That was nice. It seemed good to be relieved of that. She breathed easily, so very easily that she seemed not to be breathing at all. She sat up on the edge of the bed. She felt light, buoyant. I'll wind the clock and finish supper now and call them in. Through the semi-darkness of the old house there was no sight or sound. But as she looked up, she saw Will standing in the doorway. For a moment she thought he was standing under honey locust branches in a lane, but saw at once that it was only shadows. "Well, Will," she stood up. "I'm so glad you're home. You've been away all day, haven't you? Where were you, Will? Isn't that stupid of me not to remember?" She moved lightly toward him, but suddenly stopped, sensing that for some reason there was a strangeness about his presence. She stood looking at him questioningly, a little confused. Will was looking intently at her, half smiling. She would have thought he was joking her, teasing her a little, if his expression had not been too tender for that. "I don't quite understand, Will. Did you want something of me?" That was the way of Will's, always so quiet that you almost had to read his mind. There was no answer, but at once she seemed to know that Will was waiting for her. "Oh, I must tell the children first. They never want me to go." She turned to the window. "Listen, children," she called. "I'm going away with Father. If someone will pull up the shades, I could see you, but it doesn't really matter. Listen closely. I'm only going to be gone a little while. Be good children. You'll get along just fine." She turned to the doorway. "It seems a little dark, you know, Will. I think we will need the lantern. I've always kept the lantern." Her voice trailed off into nothing, for Will was still smiling at her, questioningly, quizzically, but with something infinitely more tender, something protecting, enveloping. Slowly it came to her. Hesitatingly she put up her hand to her throat. "Will, you don't mean it. Not that. Not death. So easy? That it's nothing more than this? Why, Will!" Abigail moved lightly, quickly over to her husband, slipped her hand into his, and went with him out of the old house, past the Lombardy poplars, through the deepening prairie twilight into the shadows. It was old Christine Reinmuller who came in and found her. "Ach, Gott!" She wrung her old hands. "Mein friend, the best woman that ever on the earth walked." The children all came hastily in response to the messages. In the old parlor with the whatnot and the marble-top stand and the blue plush album, they said the same things over and over to each other. Didn't she seem as well to you last week as ever? Do you suppose she suffered much, or called for us? Isn't it dreadful? Poor mother, all alone. Not one of us here. As though we had all forsaken her just when she needed us most, and after all she's done for us." It was then that little 12-year-old Laura Deal turned away from the window where she had been looking down the long double row of cedars, and said in a voice so certain that it was almost exalted, "I don't think it's so dreadful. I think it was kind of nice. Maybe she didn't miss you. Maybe she didn't miss you at all. One time Grandma told me she was the very happiest when she was living over all her memories. Maybe," she looked around the circle of her relatives, and there was a little bit about her of another 12-year-old child who stood in the midst of his elders in temple. "Maybe she was doing that then."